Good morning, everybody. It is Wednesday, August the 12th, and it's a beautiful day out this morning. We have fog so thick that I almost couldn't see across the street. I like that. I love fog. Um, Gosh, my hair is something else this morning, isn't it? Sorry, guys. Um, so I kind of thought, I'm doing these weekly little vlog. I don't know what you want to call this thing. But I'm doing these little weekly things, and I'm not really sure who's watching them. And honestly, I think I'm mostly doing these so that I have a structure in my life, one more structure in my life that kind of keeps me on my toes and keeps me working towards something. So I don't know that I really have a really hard purpose for these yet. Maybe that will come later. But what I do like to do with these is I do like to be able to just kind of talk, just kind of share where I'm at right now. So I thought today maybe I would talk a little bit about ancestors and spiritually and within my own religious context. It's not quite the season for that. We've got another month or two yet before we really start looking into the time of the ancestors. But this is the first inklings of fall coming. We see that the kids are getting ready for school. It's still hot out. It's still summertime. We're still dealing with summer weather, and we're not looking at any kind of fall weather yet. But, in the stores, you're starting to see things that remind you of fall. You're starting to think about apples and apple cider and cinnamony type things. And, fall's knocking on the door and coming. So ancestor time is coming too. Um, for me, I've always found, even when I was young, that the idea of ancestors was a fascinating and almost a romantic notion. The idea that there is this whole world of people that come before you that hold particular cultures or traditions or ideals, and maybe those traditions and ideas are passed on, and maybe they're not, maybe they're forgotten. And I think the idea of the forgotten ones was always a big mystery for me. I always found that to be really interesting. I've always been interested in where I come from, and I remember having conversations with my grandmother and saying, well, where do we come from? And she just would look at me like I was nuts. And I would ask her, when did we come over on the boat? And I remember having a conversation with her one time, and she was so frustrated with me. She literally looked at me and just said, "We didn't come over on a boat." And I looked back at her and said, "What, did we just sprout in Wisconsin?" And that was the end of that conversation. But I've always been interested in kind of where people come from in a much larger sense than just family of origin, home state or home country, hometown. I like to see where people come from in a much larger range. It tells me a lot about the person. And I don't mean this to be any kind of a negative thing or even a racist or a cultural thing. But when you see people that have backgrounds to different cultures, whether they're aware of it or not, you can still see inklings of those cultures in the things that they do, the way they act, what they say, how they think. Um, there's no joke behind the fact that people frequently say, good strong German stock. Well, Germans have historically been known to be solid people, hardworking people, just like many other cultures. But you can kind of see that in the work ethics of the people, I think, as as you kind of get to know folks and where they come from. This is getting kind of convoluted, isn't it? Bear with me. What I'm getting at is at this time of the year, I do start thinking about ancestors. This week, particularly, I think of ancestors. This Monday was actually the 5th anniversary of my grandmother passing, which was a really hard thing for me to wrap my head around. Um, when I was younger, she used to drive me nuts. I think we drove each other nuts. Um, I just didn't understand. She was in a wheelchair from a time when I was fairly young on up until the day she died. So I didn't really understand why Grandma was always so cranky. I just knew I didn't like hanging out at Grandma's house much more than I had to because Grandma was cranky. I liked Grandpa because, Grandpa was fun. Mostly Grandpa gave me everything I wanted. Isn't that the way Grandpas are? Um, but Grandma was cranky and I just didn't want to be around Grandma that much when I was young. And then when I got to college and my life kind of imploded in college, I started to lean more on Grandma at that time and started to actually talk to her as an elder, as somebody that could maybe guide me. Um, I mean, and she had been guiding me. She had been a constant source, a constant force in my life from a very young age. At various times in my life, she was actually, if not my primary caregiver, a very strong caregiver in my life. So it's not like she was never there to guide me before. It's just, when kids are young, they're stubborn and stupid and they know everything and they don't want to hang out with the elders because the elders are boring. Because we're not really taught the value of elders in this country the way that many other cultures do. Um, at least not at an age where we should be appreciating them. We learn it much later when that appreciation is, um, we learn it later when we really can't utilize their wisdoms anymore, like when they're gone. Um, but yeah, I started to lean on my grandmother more when I was in college. And then after I moved to Wisconsin and I was up here for a couple of years, she and I got to be very, very close. There were a lot of conversations that we had about life and love and people and religion. And religion was a big one for my grandmother and I. She was also my godmother. And I think in a lot of ways, until later in her life, I think that she may have felt that she had failed as my godparent, because my religious path on the outside looks very divergent from how I was raised. And I think that frustrated and worried her and maybe even scared her some. But I know that later on in her life, we were able to talk a little more deeply about the similarities between our two faiths. And not only that, but the core of who I am hasn't changed. I'm still a person who honors the great divine. I am still a being on this planet trying to respect all of my co inhabitants, and that never changed. The only thing that changed was the names that I used to call to my God. And so I my dad and I, so about 5 years ago, she broke her leg and had to go into a nursing home. And at that time, I was going through about I was preparing to go into a hysterectomy, which was a much needed surgery and a much asked for and begged for surgery. I spent many years asking for this surgery. And she fell down and she broke her leg, and she and my dad decided that recuperation in a nursing home was a good call, and that drove me nuts. I wanted nothing more than to go home and take care of her because I have training in this particular field. And as a family, we decided that my surgery was more important than me coming back down because she would be taken care of. It would be okay. Um, it ended up that she wasn't. The nursing home was a major contributor in her passing, I believe, due to a number of things that it doesn't really matter right now. But my dad and I were talking on the phone the day that she passed, and I said, I think I'm looking at the weekend, and he says, I don't think you should look at the weekend. I think you should come now. So I came home and missed my grandmother's actual passing, but was honored to be asked to perform her funeral at graveside, which is probably one of the hardest things that any human being can ever do, is to be the religious officiant to the burying of your best friend. But I think about my grandmother, and I think about the things that she's taught me. And she's taught me the basic things like, how to cook, how to sew, how to crochet and craft. And we would have hours and hours and hours, even when I was a teenager and even a little younger. hours and hours where we would just sit and craft together. We would try every craft out there. We went through painting t-shirts and sweatshirts and jean jacket phase. We went through the bedazzler phase. We went through crocheting and crow knitting and crow whatever hybrids. And, you know, she sewed my prom dress for me, my senior prom. I didn't like what was out there. Everything that was out there was too, um, it just wasn't me. So my grandmother designed and made my prom dress for me, which I still have. It's beautiful. Um, but I think too about the stories she's told. She's told stories about her growing up and how, you know, helping milk the cows and helping to raise her siblings because her father died when she was fairly young. You know, about her mother working. There's silly stories that she's told me about the Cosmo magazine that I have inherited with the Burt Reynolds centerfold, and those of you of a certain age will know exactly what I'm talking about. But it was something that her mother apparently had taken from the laundromat that my grandmother inherited, and then it was passed on to me. So I have the traveling Cosmo. But she would tell stories about Grandpa's family a little bit, you know, as much as she knew, and she would talk about being the wife of an enlisted serviceman, being the wife of a man who was a POW and missing, being the wife of a man who served his full term in the military as a lifer, the struggles of dealing with his health after that, the struggles of raising the three children that she had, who each have very unique and strong personalities, very different from each other. And, you know, the struggles and joys that she's had with raising them and the photos. And she would tell me all of these things. But I could never really get too much further back past her parents, Grandpa's parents, you know, to get back into the actual culture of where we've come from. I remember her telling me one time how hard it was to acknowledge that you had German blood in you because of World War II with all of the issues with the Nazis and how it was difficult for people sometimes to differentiate in their minds between Nazis and people who had German blood. That there is a big difference, which I imagine would be somewhat similar to how many Japanese Americans were treated during that same period of time. Um, but I like to think about her as, you know, not just a living source that was in my life, but now she is part of my collective ancestry. She is part of the wisdoms that I can turn to during this time of the year, beginning this time of the year, to find wisdoms, to find strength, to find the courage to go on through hard parts in my life, to kind of hold a mirror up and say, this is what life was like for my ancestors. This is what life is like for me, and compare the two. And in many ways, there aren't comparisons. There's how do you compare your life when you're living in a relatively peaceful society? Can be debated, I know. But compared to an actively in wartime society where people are rationing, where you don't know where your family members are, where you don't know if your children are going to be drafted and sent off, um, or, you know, even living through the aftermath of that. I think mostly I just wanted to kind of acknowledge my grandmother today. Um, it's been a hard 5 years without her, and I would say that um, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think of her, and there's probably not a week that goes by that I don't still try and pick up the phone. I met a woman on Saturday during the sidewalk sales who was telling me about her father and how much she misses him, and I realized that for people who have lost someone in their lives, you don't really know always that there are many of us out here that understand exactly what you're going through. Reach out and talk about that family member. When you talk about them, they're not really gone. They're still there. And I think that's mostly what I wanted to say today. So I hope this was meaningful for some of you out there. I hope you have a good week, and I will see you next Wednesday. Thank you.